This is my report on the Chumash people in what is now known as Southern California. So the Chumash people at time of Spanish contact had a population of about 20,000 people spread out between around 150 permanent villages, spreading between modern-day San Luis Obispo down to modern-day Ventura County. There was a lot of diversity in the Chumash people, both culturally and in settlement patterns, because they had three main sub-regional populations. There was the Channel Islands populations on the Channel Islands off the coast of what is now Southern California. The coastal mainland, so the Chumash that are on the mainland, but just along the coast, and then the inland mainland. So the Chumash that lived on the mainland of what is now modern day California, further inland past the coast, so no water access. The Chumash were also wonderful tradesmen and craftsmen. The Chumash people historically spoke a group of related languages that belonged to the Hokan language family, which is one of the oldest and most diverse language families in North America. The Chumashan languages were distinct and complex, reflecting the sophisticated culture of the Chumash people. These languages were once spoken along the central and southern coast of California and on the Channel Islands. So, this in the settlement pattern, again, as I said earlier, there was a vast amount of diversity between the three subregional populations. So, on the Channel Islands, they relied heavily on the ocean for food, including shellfish, marine mammals, and seaweed. So the Channel Islands does not have many terrestrial species that are endemic to the Channel Islands. So they had to largely rely on the ocean for food. So they developed a lot of maritime technologies, including the tomol, which was a palanque canoe, which allowed them to travel between the islands and the mainland for trade and fishing. So they traded with the mainland groups a lot so that they could get acorns and plant materials from the mainland that wouldn't grow on the islands. So the villages were strategically located near freshwater springs on the island, so they always had access to drinking water. And also protected harbors that would be easy to enter in and out of the ocean, but also keep boats safe during storms. So they lived in domed houses made of whale bones and tule reeds or seagrasses. And so they exchanged a lot of the shell beads to the mainland because they had a surplus of beads on the island itself. And we'll get to the shell beads in a moment. So the coastal mainland was kind of the spot to be. It was in between the island and the inland populations. So it was a major crossroads for trade. So they had a balanced diet of both terrestrial and marine sources, including fish, shellfish, acorn, seeds, and game. They utilized tidal zones for shellfish collecting and for easy fishing. Coastal villages were often the largest, with populations reaching into the hundreds, supported by the abundance of resources from the ocean and bountiful coasts. The houses were very similar to the island Chumash, but a lot larger to reflect the increase in resources. They often served as the intermediaries in trade between island and inland groups, often acting as facilitators for the widespread exchange of goods. And then we'll go to the inland mainland, which were some of the more resilient of the Chumash people because they had to deal with harder environments. So they relied nearly solely on terrestrial resources like acorns, nuts, and game animals. So they had limited use of marine resources. They were able to obtain fish and shellfish through trade, as well as the beads, as I mentioned earlier, but through trade. So they had extensive knowledge of the plant resources for food, medicine, and tools, because that was the resources available to them because they did not have access to the coast. Villages were a lot smaller and more dispersed compared to the coastal communities, and houses were made from available materials like willow branches, grasses, and tool reeds, but you're not going to find whalebone like you would on the coast or islands. The inland Chumash developed specialized crafts, including basketry. They made very good baskets, tools, and other items that they would then trade in with the other groups, because they needed a lot of the maritime products that they couldn't naturally get access to. The Chumash were hunters, gatherers, craftsmen, and traders. The Chumash created watertight baskets that they used with hot stones to boil soups inside the basket using the hot stones they would take out of the fire. Since the Chumash were a maritime people, they had access to shells to make into beads. The Chumash shell beads were found as far as Yosemite and New Mexico, because they were used so often as trade, as money for up to 2,000 years ago. So speaking of those beads, when the Spanish arrived, they wanted to get in with this native economy, but since the natives didn't trade in coins and metals, what the Spanish did is they started making very ornate beads out of glass so that they could participate in the native economy. And since the coastal region was the crossroads of trade, as I mentioned earlier, that's where the Spanish put up a bunch of their missions, both as trade hubs and also as ease of access to the most amount of native people. Talking about the mission system was the most organized aspect of Spanish colonialism that affected the Chumash. The Spanish set up 5 missions in Chumash territory, including the Mission San Luis Obispo de Tolosa, Mission San Buenaventura, Mission Santa Barbara, Mission La Purísima Concepción, and Mission Santa Ynez. And these missions were set up to convert the natives to Catholicism, but they were also just a lot like the slave plantations in the antebellum American South, where they were large facilities where natives were worked as slave labor. They were constructing mission buildings, farming, and raising livestock, which was a vast difference from their traditional ways, which had them lose a lot of autonomy and their own language and culture. The language and culture was severely stifled by the Catholic Church, with physical beatings and other intense consequences for speaking your native language, or especially celebrating any native religion instead of Catholicism. So the mission system allowed for disease to fester and spread in between many of the Chumash people, causing their 20,000 pre-contact population to dwindle down to 2,500 Chumash in the 1830s when the missions were shut down. In 1824, the Chumash revolted against mission rule. The Spanish eventually quelled the revolt, but it demonstrated the Chumash's resilience and unwillingness to accept colonization passively. Doing my report on the Chumash people was relatively easy for me as a Californian. I was raised, taught about the mission system, so a lot of stories about specifically the Chumash were familiar to me. I have a lot of family that live in the ancestral lands of the Chumash, and so I have visited the missions there and learned about the Chumash, and visited other history museums in the area to learn about the Chumash. I recently went down to San Luis Obispo a couple weeks ago and went to the to their local historical society to learn about the Chumash. The education plan in public schools for the mission system is far too Eurocentric. It does not take in the native account enough, and I saw that reflected in my own research, where I could not find any textual resources from the emic perspective, but I could find audio and video resources from the emic perspective, so I tried to supplement my research with that. But all the text-based sources were Etic and Origin. I thank you so much for your time.